Maybe I start by sharing my screen to you all. I hope this works. Do you see it?
Yes.
All right. So my talk today is called Populist Leaders, the Economy and the Pandemic. What can we expect? And basically, as I am working for the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, my talk will have a special focus on the economy, but I will also touch upon the pandemic in the second part of the presentation. In the part on the economy, I will present my own research, and in the part on the pandemic, I will refer to research that was conducted within our institute and by members of my research team. So I just want to stress that before I start. But first of all, I have to apologize that I couldn't attend the first keynote speech. So I don't know in how far you have already discussed what populism is and maybe how we can measure it, because that will be the starting point of my talk. And yeah, the last part will sort of bring the economy and the pandemic under populist leadership sort of together and conclude. So yeah, we lack still, I mean, I appreciate these initiatives that we have like a whole research center dealing exclusively with populism, and that we have journals like emerging that are called populism or populism and politics. I mean, this is amazing, but still we are lacking knowledge on populism and especially on populists in power. So we have heard a little bit about it also in by Mark Findlay, that he talked about the anxiety and the climate crisis and the financial crisis as a determinant of populism. But there's not so much work yet on the consequences of populists in power. And that is what I want to focus on today, because I think that's the way to proceed and to go forward within this research area of populism. First of all, one could say that, like, examining the literature, that over the past 2 decades, there has emerged sort of a consensus or minimal definition of populism, and that is that populism is mainly defined as a political strategy or as a political style, not so much as a thick ideology, but more like a rhetoric, like a style, like a strategy. And at the very core of the strategy is the struggle of the people versus the elites. The populists claims to represent the pure people, the good people, the honest people, and these people are inherently in opposition to a corrupt elite. And the role of the populist is to defend this good people from this evil elite. And this theme sort of penetrates the populist discourse from beginning to the end. So in the campaign and also when the populist is in power. And then populism can adapt to like a thicker ideology, left-wing ideology, meaning the populist campaigns against financial and economic elites and for redistribution, so giving money from the rich elites to the poor people. And or the populist is on the right-wing political side, and that means the criticism of the elite is cultural, and the main critique is that the elite protects, the political elite protects ethnic, religious minorities and foreigners at the expense of the native population. So populism can sort of assume these two faces, the left wing and the right wing. And I want to now briefly present a research paper that I've written together with Moritz Schularek of Bonn and Christoph Trebesch, also from Kiel Institute. And this paper is called Populist Leaders and the Economy. And in this paper, we classify like 1,500 leaders either as populist or non-populist, and as right-wing and as left-wing. And our data set covers 60 countries and 120 years. And how do we arrive at the final classification of who is a populist and who is not a populist? We fortunately can make use of the huge literature that has emerged and that also very often has a historical focus. And so we collected basically from Google Scholar and main research publication databases, all articles that have populism or populist in the title. And then we made this machine readable and then scanned the names of all independent country leaders since 1900. So presidents and prime ministers. And then we extracted those parts of the sources where the leader is described by the populism expert who has written the paper. And then we decided if the leader fits, the description of the leader fits the definition of populism that I've outlined earlier. And we disregard borderline cases, but we only include clear-cut cases of populism. And this way we find 50 clear-cut populist leaders. And we then plotted the share of countries that were governed by a leader that is classified as a populist in the political science literature. The share of countries where this was the case in all countries, independent countries that were in our sample in each year. And we can see that populism had hit its high times also in the interwar period and also from the 50s to the 70s, mostly in Latin America. And since the year 2000, roughly, we see like a secular increase in the share of countries worldwide that are governed by populists. And this is mainly due to more right-wing populism and also outside of Latin America, more in Europe and Western countries. As an example, I show here a list of populists in power for the year 2018. I mean, this is obviously our way to code it, our way to proceed. This is up to debate, especially if you present that in front of an international audience. There often like listeners will like mention specific cases from their countries where they disagree or not, and so on and so forth. But this is what we come up with, and this is what we use for the for further analysis. And one key result is that populist leaders often rule for many years. So the average time of populists in office is about 7.5 years or 8 years, compared to 4 years for non-populist leaders. So populists are persistent in relative terms. And also they have a high re-election probability. So over 30% of the populist leaders in our sample have returned to office. And for non-populist leaders, the return probability is only half in size. And here you can also see that populism at the federal level or government level is serious. So we have this long and repeating spells of populist leadership that we can observe in many countries, not all of them, but for some countries, this really stands out as a pattern. And our idea then, because we are economists, was to use this sample of populists here and to estimate how the economy develops when these leaders are in power. So after these leaders have come to power. And this is what I will now explain in more detail in the second part. So we used the coded sample of populist leaders to study the economic consequences of populism. And our focus was basically on these topics that populists often, as representatives of the people, they often like pander to the people and make campaign promises and promise to better the situation of the average citizen. So their focus is on income distribution, on inequality, on consumption, on income per capita. But also we hear from the political science literature that often, and this is, I think, also a core topic of this conference, populists pursue politics in the area of economic nationalism, protectionism, often overspending or huge debt is involved, and also the erosion of checks and balances under populists is a problem. So these may be channels through which populist governments could affect the developments of the economies, looking at growth literature, so determinants of growth. I will not talk too much about like the specific methodologies that we use, but just as a start, what we first did was we looked at the 15 years after which the populists came to power, and then simply estimated whether was a growth gap. So a gap in the performance of the economy of the country compared to the long run average performance of the country. And what we found was that we found an almost 1 percentage point negative GDP growth gap. So there's an output loss that is associated with populism. And we then also use a little bit more rigorous methodologies. So panel fixed effects regressions, you would call that, an econometrician would call that panel fixed effects regression, and our results remained robust to this. So there is some indication that economies suffer from populist governance. But we cannot be sure if we look at one specific country and compare it to the long run average of the country, or for example, if you compare Germany to all other European Union countries, or only to Austria, you don't know if the economy of Austria or the European economy is a good counterfactual for the German economy. So what we did was we construct synthetic so-called doppelganger economies. That is, you take a weighted average of economies that have a path similar to the treated economy at the time when the populist comes to power. So this allows for a more rigorous comparison between the populist economy and a counterfactual. So you assume, for example, that, or let me put it this way, the emergence of populism is often connected, for example, to economic crisis or financial crisis. And this algorithm that we use here makes it sure that the economies to which we compare the populist country also experienced such crisis before the new government came to power. And one way to show this is to plot the GDP growth 30 years around, say, Berlusconi came to power in Italy in 2001, and this would then span the years from 1985 to 2015. And you can see that the solid line here is the average for the populist economies, and the dotted line here is the average for these synthetic economies that we have created. And we can see clearly that there is a gap between these two economies. This is maybe a better way to show this. So there's a 10 percentage point loss under populist governments compared to non-populist governments in the 15 years after these governments come to power. And then we use the same empirical approach also for potential channels of populist policies. And we also found that there is, to a certain degree, an increase in protectionism under populists. So the import tariffs increase by about 10 percentage points. This is large compared to the sample average was 15% in tariffs. Also, the ratio of debt to GDP increases, so there's more government debt under populist politicians. And which is, in my opinion, the most relevant channel or most interesting channel is that institutions erode. As an example, take an index on the constraints on the judicial constraints on the executive. You can also see that this index really declines from year 0 to year 10 strongly. And we've seen countless examples of this attacks on the the judiciary, and also we made the same estimations for press freedom and also for electoral freedom, and we also found that all these institutional indicators systematically decline under populist governments. Now, I am not an expert on, in general, on maybe I don't know if I'm maybe wrong here, but I have so far not conducted any research on the pandemic, because the focus of my research is historical, and I'm kind of like shy away from like analyzing an ongoing event, but I will present research by Michael Bayerlein. He is from my institute, and he has papers on the impact of COVID on populism, will it be weakened, and also how populist governments mishandle the pandemic. And why I chose this paper here is because the approach is similar to what we have estimated for the populist economies. So they use a comparable statistical approach, but they study if populist governments perform differently in terms of a variety of measures related to the management of the pandemic. So their sample is smaller. They only look at at 2020. And they only feature 11 populist governments, comparing them to 42 non-populist governments. And first of all, what they find is that there was an initial, this graphic here shows from polling data, the change in government support. So this, in Germany, it's called the Sunday question. Would you support the current government right now? So this is survey data evaluated. And you can see that just after COVID arrived, so initially populists suffered voter support in the few days just after the pandemic started. And one possible reaction, which they also outline in their paper, is that populists then took a different course than other governments in terms of fighting this pandemic. They used data on here, particularly this COVID-19 government response tracker by the Oxford University. This tracks the degree of measures by governments taken to get the pandemic under control, meaning lockdowns, vaccination, masks, mandatory masks, and the like. And they, in this graphic, they, like we did with the GDP growth or the economy, they here compare populist governments to non-populist governments in terms of how strong were the containment measures. And they find that over the year 2020, there was a significantly larger effort by non-populist governments to undertake containment measures compared to populist governments. Here the green lines are populist governments, and this red line here or gray line above are all other governments. So this was maybe the reaction by populists for the initial uncertainty among voters to take a different path concerning pandemic management, and maybe a path that was not so strict or restrictive as non-populist conventional governments would have went. And one, in their paper, they present kind of they propose that one outcome of this loser pandemic management could be that excess mortality in 2020 under Populist, here the green line, increased compared to non-populist governments, and by the end of 2020 it was twice as high as in non-populist countries. To conclude, the first part, the key takeaway of the first part is that populism tends to be bad economics. So, I mean, this study was explorative, and this is not an ultimate truth that I present, but in the majority of cases, compared to a plausible counterfactual, we see that there is a decline in real GDP per capita. We also see that populists typically enact policies of economic protectionism. We also see that government debt, public debt levels increase systematically under populist governments. And we see that a range of institutional strength, institutional quality measures go down the drain when populists come to power. And this may be also one of the channels, not only because we know that institutions, functioning institutions, are key for innovation, for education, for growth of an economy. So this could be an important channel why economies on balance suffer under populist governance. But this also could be an explanation of why maybe despite the economy suffers, voters or populists still manage to be in power for long periods of time, precisely because they erode certain checks and balances that are meant to monitor and control them. And on the second part, the pandemic, we have seen from the paper by Bayerlein et al. That countries governed by populists experience higher excess mortality than conventional countries. We have also seen that initially populist governments lost voter support. And in the following, they, this is like my interpretation of it, is that these governments, the policy response in general of these governments might have been a little bit more opportunistic and up to inadequate compared to other countries. And also there is this permanent discussion about, or this topic of misinformation, of downplaying, and also of anti-science opinions, or that populists often raise, and this could also somehow in the end result to this increased excess mortality that they have found in their paper. But this is obviously something that is up to debate. In general, my takeaway would be that, I mean, we don't have to forget, like, managing a twin crisis of the economy and public health with multiple trade overs and multiple spillovers. I mean, even we as scientists cannot, like, right now get the full picture of the multiple thousands, millions of effects at work. This is demanding, but it could be even more demanding for populist governments who often propose simple solutions to complex problems, and also very, like, easy truths that are easy to transport to the people. So I think managing such a pandemic and such an economic crisis requires a lot of expertise, patience, trust, and all of this. And I think that populist governments are maybe not the best candidates to like show these skills at the moment. I can say that from the research that I've conducted myself and that I've read. And for like the years to come, the question will be if populists, despite their maybe problems in the management of crisis and of the pandemic, will still somehow not suffer too much from it, because this rally around the flag effect and this focus on my country first, my nation first, or my family first, maybe will, if many people return to this dogma, this will help populists disregarding how the country then really develops. Or the other opportunity is, or the other possibility is that these populist governments will simply be punished in the end by the voters for the economic and public health related performance of their countries. We will see that in the years to come. Thanks a lot.